All right, thanks, Deborah, for that always warm but unpredictable introduction. um, and I'm glad to be back here again with you guys, as usual. I love talking about Lightroom, but more importantly, I love talking about photography because that's pretty much what it's all about for me. I mean, all this are just sort of things that we use to get what's in our minds and in our hearts out. And that's where I like to start with, and that's really the whole point of getting up, putting on the bag, going out for a hike, whatever. So even though we're using these very specific tools that I'm going to talk about, I think that any discussion about Lightroom or any software whatsoever really has to start with thinking about photographic vision. And this is going to be, I may be preaching to the choir to some of you who have been here before, but it still is worth remembering even for myself because this stuff can be seductive and interesting and exciting, and it used to be every week, now it's like every 3 hours there's a new version of some plugin or whatever online, especially if you follow Twitter. But it has to start with photography because if you don't have a vision about what you want to accomplish, then of course the tools just become they sort of get in the way. And even if you are interested in experimenting, meaning that you may not have a specific goal, well, that's a goal in itself. If you're interested in experimenting, you still have to have that goal in mind. So you still need constraints. Yes, limitless opportunities are great, but having constraints keeps you within some boundaries that I think are useful creatively until you know when to go beyond those. So for those of you who saw the first presentation I did, which was creative developing in Lightroom, this is sort of a part 2. I'm going to go more in depth into some of the things that I spoke about in the first one, namely less about the very basic things in the develop module and more about what I call the things that really help bring an image to life. So local adjustments, things in the basic panel that actually have to do with how the image conveys what you're trying to get across, and a little bit more in terms of what that all means from a standpoint of looking at the whole picture, okay? And it'll become clearer as I go along. So again, photographic vision, it's what you're trying to convey, what the image is about. These are the things you should be thinking about when you start working on your images. What is the image about? And then that will lead you to be able to make the adjustments necessary for that. Now, the best way to use Lightroom, as I said, is to have a general vision or about what you want to accomplish. And that's composed of a couple of things. One, as I mentioned, your vision and your goal, what you want to get across, okay? Number 2, it involves a strong sense of composition. Unfortunately, that is the case because if you don't have a strong sense of composition, and strong being a relative word, I'm not saying you have to be some master of composition, but if you don't have a sense of how the composition that you've captured works, then it's going to be hard for you to use a tool to improve on that composition in a way that lets viewers see what you're trying to get across. So having a sense of composition for me has been really worthwhile. And the more I study and learn about composition, the better I get at Lightroom, because then I know what I want to do with the image to make the composition come to life. We're not showing people how great we are at Lightroom, we're showing them images, and that all they care about is whether they like it or not. All right, and then the third thing is interpretation. And that's the most critical one because once you understand what you want to accomplish, and how you can go about that with composition, then you can start to make an interpretation of the image. Assuming that everyone is shooting in RAW, which I always suggest that you do, you start with a fairly flat image, a flat-looking image because the camera is not applying anything to it whatsoever. And the most critical thing that I think everyone should understand, and I repeat this over and over again in workshops, is that a camera, a physical camera, an actual digital camera, does not see or photograph the world the way we see it with our eyes. We have built-in contrast, built-in color correction, built-in all kinds of stuff in our brains that make what we see in the world look a certain way. Camera doesn't capture it like that at all. And so that's a part of developing in Lightroom, is bringing back the way we see images, okay, and then also going beyond that and interpreting it to go not from what we see, but what we're feeling when we go out and take images, okay? So workflow starts at capture, as I mentioned. Vision and interpretation, that drives the editing. Okay, so what you're going to do in Lightroom is already being formulated in your head when you're out capturing the image. That helps to lead the viewer through the image and show them what's important about the image, what the subject is, what the subject isn't, and also keep them involved and keep them interactively involved with the image, whether that means you're asking them questions or you're answering questions for them. That keeps them looking at the image over and over again. An image that doesn't have that is one where you sort of just glance at it and then go on to the next one. And finally, that allows you to share your perspective and your vision, okay? Now, I want to just mention a few basics of visual design, because these are also important things that you will have to deal with when you're editing your images. Things like tonality, all right? There's a lot of tonality in terms of how that interprets an image and how we can work with Lightroom to interpret that. Lines, shapes, color, and focus. By focus, I mean what's sharp and what's not sharp. And these are things that we can all adjust in Lightroom, but more importantly, all of these design elements have a huge impact on the compositional structure of an image, and more importantly, how effective the image becomes when we're done. All right, so let me show you a couple of examples before and after. I'm just going to highlight what I did in the images. As I mentioned, this is similar to the first presentation, but I'm going to show less and go deeper into each image. So this is Hudson River, about 45 minutes north of here, in the Hudson Highlands. And so this is an image that I captured, and compositionally, I'm looking at the foreground and the rocks and the light leading up to the middle ground, which is sort of those trees, and then towards a few other layers getting back into the fog. And I love to build images up like this in terms of layering from front to back, because that adds depth. And depth is critical because, as I said, we want to convey what it feels like to be in a place, or what I felt like. I want to convey what I felt like to be in a place. And the closer I can get that to matching that sense of emotion, then the more effective the image is going to be. So what I want to do here is, this is my main line here that leads the image, basically brings the viewer into the image, okay? There's textural contrast between this and this and this. So this area here needs to be sort of brought out more so that it kind of matches this area on this side. Not necessarily matching in tonality, but so that it's interesting. Right now it's too dark, and so it just kind of becomes an area where the eye's going to get lost. Secondly, I want to make this middle ground here a little more interesting, all right, with light and with tonality, making it brighter, making it a little bit more interactive depth-wise. And that's going to lead up to these clouds here, and also the sky needs to become what I call a player, which means that it has to actually play a role in the image. And right now it's not, because it's sort of washed out. Why is it washed out? Well, because this is a straight raw file captured on my camera where I was strictly looking at two things. Number one, composition, and number two, the histogram. Those are the only two things that I'm interested in when I'm capturing images. Number one, that I have the right composition, right? Obviously that's the key, and composition involves the light and the subjects and etc. And the second thing is that I have captured the tones that I need in the image to work with. So either I don't blow highlights out or I don't blow shadows out. And in this case, this image fit within the dynamic range of my camera, so I didn't blow highlights or shadows out. Then these are once I know that I haven't blown out my highlights, for example here, then I can work with those and make them a part of the image. All right, and so that is the final result. Okay, so it's the same image, right? But very subtle adjustments which make the depth and the layers in the image much more obvious. Notice I mentioned this area down here, which now you can see this texture here kind of forms this interesting shape. The rocks here, and then leading to the middle ground. These trees here are more interesting. I threw a little more, some dodging over here, which makes the other side of the tree darker. That makes it more three-dimensional. And then we lead up to the clouds, which have so much texture and just pull you into the image, okay? Without me having a sense of compositionally what I wanted to achieve, then I'd be basically sitting at Lightroom pushing sliders around, but that's not what gets to what I want to convey. Second example, much more complicated image in terms of composition, because there's a lot going on, and the key is to make it as simple as possible. But from an editing standpoint, okay, and this is where visualization is so important. When I'm shooting this image in the field, I'm kind of already thinking what I'm going to do in Lightroom, or how I'm going to at least begin to process the image in Lightroom. There's a couple of different elements here. We have the reflection in the foreground, this middle ground and background. I talked about layers, right? So I know that this area here needs to be brought out more because I could see it. And when I was there, I could see the grass and I could see the trees. I'm sorry, trees here. I can see them clearly. The camera doesn't capture that because, again, this is a raw file that's pretty flat. And also I have to darken down this area up here and the sky because it wasn't that washed out. It was much warmer and redder and more dramatic, again, in terms of not only how I saw it, but how I felt about it. It was just amazing glowing red, and that's what I want to bring across. All right, so again, using just, I say basic, but they're basic ideas, okay, the concepts. Dodging this area, which dodging means brightening, burning means darkening. So dodging this area here, darkening this area up here, darkening the sky up here so that actually forms a nice symmetry with the reflection in the bottom. Dodging some of these rocks so that they become focal points in the foreground. Okay, that's what I'm talking about when I say that having a sense of what the image should be then allows you to go into Lightroom, and then you're just worrying about how to achieve what you have in your head. Okay, one more. The last one, by the way, was a canyon in just outside of Moab, Utah. This one is Mount Beacon, where I live, about 2 miles from my house. And I can get into a whole discussion about why it's great to just photograph your backyard over and over and over and over again, but I'll leave that for another time. So again, this image, this is the way, this wasn't the way it looked or felt at all. But this is the proper exposure to capture as much of the tonality as possible on my sensor, which means that I'm exposing to the right. It's going to be brighter, but I'm going to have less shadow, noise, and I'm going to be able to work with it more in Lightroom. But this was much darker, much moodier, almost more mysterious, if you will. Okay, so what I want to do here is I want to darken this path so that it's darker, leading up to this area up here. Again, working with tonalities and contrast. I want to darken sort of these areas up here so that the light falling on these leaves here is much more dramatic. All right, and that's the final result. All right, so that is the feel and the mood that I want to bring across. It's not the capture. The camera doesn't know what I feel. The camera is just a tool that I'm pressing buttons on. Okay, so, and I just have one more I'll go through quickly. Again, a very sort of dark capture. You would think that it's too dark, but again, looking at the histogram, I haven't clipped anything in the shadows except for a small little spot down here, which was black, and I didn't mind that. And I've maintained highlight detail on top. And that's the final, okay? So bringing up the shadows, which are the shadows that I saw, otherwise I wouldn't have made the composition had I not been able to see these rocks with the light on them. And then darkening down the sky to bring it more within range of what our eyes experience and what our eyes see, okay? So back to Lightroom. So in Lightroom, what are my favorite tools? What are my favorite tools? Everything that I've showed you so far, it was all done in Lightroom, obviously. And I like using my favorite tools to get this across is number one, using the basic panel, because there's some very powerful controls in the basic panel, like the highlights and shadow, especially the highlight control and the shadow control. Secondly is the HSL control, because the HSL control allows you to very precisely adjust individual colors, okay, whether it's luminance or saturation or hue, and that's very powerful, especially when you think about skies, because skies are mostly blue, and so now you can affect the sky without having to actually make a mask or a selection. And finally, the local tools being the most critical and the most creative ones. I love the local tools because those are the ones that really make an image come to life. You're being able to make subtle adjustments so that some things become more pronounced than other things. And that's really the art of composition. The art of composition is how do you take a landscape that you shoot at 18 millimeters, which has everything in it in terms of the landscape, and then when you show it to someone, they only see that one thing that you saw that was the most interesting thing. You do that through highlighting and darkening other things and making things sharper and other things less sharp, etc. All right? Let me just do a couple of images here, and we'll go through each one so you can see what I've done. So here, I'm going to work on this one first. This is an image of the Hudson River, about 45 miles north of here, where I do a lot of my work. This is the final, all right, and that's the original capture, all right. And what I mean by, again, the histogram is, here's the histogram in Lightroom. You can see I haven't clipped highlights or shadows, except for probably the sun here, which is slightly clipped, and even if it is or isn't, the sun is not something that you want to retain detail in because it's just a bright spot. So I'm mostly interested in retaining as much detail as possible, but especially in the shadows, because that's where the majority of the detail lies. The majority of the detail is in the shadows down here, not up here. So as when I take the picture in the field and I look at my histogram, if I don't see any clipping in the shadows, then I know that I've retained this shadow detail, and I can open that up, if you will. By opening up, I mean make it visible when I make a print or when I show it online, all the detail that's in here, okay? So let me show you how I went about doing that. I'm going to jump into the develop module, and I'm not going to go over a lot of the basics in the basic panel because, as I said, that I covered in the first presentation. I'll cover the most important ones. So usually I always start with temperature. In this case, I'm happy with the temperature. I can see that it's warm enough with the glow on the rocks down here, and I also see that the sky has some blue to it, and temperature is white balance is really a question of balancing warm with cool depending on how you want the image to look, because I don't know what the actual temperature is, and nothing here is neutral gray because it's a morning shot and the light is going to be very warm. So visually, based on what I see here, I'm happy with the white balance there. However, I want to increase the exposure a bit because I know that by increasing the exposure I can get a little bit more of the shadows down here. Okay, so I'm going to go up to about 40 or 30 there maybe. All right. I'm not going to add too much contrast for now. I'm going to pull down the highlights because once I pull the highlights, I know that that'll help me recover back the sky, which is I need. Okay, maybe not so much. And all of this, when you're making adjustments, all of this is always sort of a balance. You go back and forth. One adjustment affects a little bit another one, and so you're constantly going back and forth to see how it affects the image. Okay. Definitely going to boost shadows. So these are the two that I mentioned I really like to use a lot, highlights and shadows. Why? Because I want to expose more of the shadow detail in here. So I'm going to push the shadows up to about there, okay, 30. Whites I'm going to leave okay for now because I'm happy with the white point. White point is going to be this brightest area up here, and I'm okay with that. And blacks, I'm going to leave the blacks where they are. Again, if I press the Option key or the Alt key on the PC and I click on my black slider, I get this white overlay, and as I adjust my black point, the things that as I pull down on the blacks, meaning as I add more black, the areas of the image that are starting to clip, you'll see they have to start to get this black black areas. And so that's telling me that those areas are clipped, and so I don't want that. A quick way to reset any control is to just double click like that, and I get back to blacks at 0. And I'm going to leave blacks at 0 for now because, again, as I said, my black point is really pretty much right there. I don't need to have anything else clipping. Clarity, I'm definitely going to add clarity. Clarity adds, again, micro contrast, but it also has a tendency, or a good tendency, to brighten darker areas of the image. So it adds micro contrast, which means that it adds contrast to details, and it also tends to brighten up darker areas. And so you notice as I add clarity, the foreground is getting darker and darker. If you go too far, then you can go towards, this starts looking like HDR, like an HDR type of look. That's what kind of clarity does. So you have to be careful depending on what your what your goal is, whether you want that or not. And in this case, I don't want that. I want a really more of a natural, organic looking image. So I'm going to stop around 30. And vibrance, I'm going to add some vibrance. Vibrance is kind of a intelligent saturation. It adds color to areas of the image that are less saturated to begin with. All right, so it kind of balances the saturation out as opposed to saturation, the saturation slider here, which just adds color to everything evenly. Vibrance adds it kind of intelligently, so it sees areas that have less color, it adds more to them. All right. So that's pretty much it with the basic panel here. Okay. I'm not going to do anything with the tone curve. Again, the tone curve is to add more contrast. I think I have enough contrast as it is right now, so I'm not going to do anything there. Looking at the image now, I'm going to add a little more just basic contrast here. All right, so I went up to about 9 or 10. HSL controls, I'm going to come back to this later because as I make adjustments, you'll see. But one of the things that I would like to do, in my mind, I'm thinking that I'd like to make this part of the image a little brighter right down here in the bottom. And I know one way I could do that is by, or at least one way of doing it is by using the blue channel. Whether it'll work or not, I don't know. But this is mostly blue. And so Rather than paint a mask here, I can always say, well, let me go to the luminance channel. I'll do it now because I'm already here. If I go to the luminance channel and push up the blue, you see I'm able to ever so slightly, well, I don't see anything either. So let's see here. If I click here, it's getting a little brighter down here. Okay, not a whole lot. That's making it darker, that's making it brighter. So it's a very subtle adjustment. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, depending on what the colors are, okay? So I'm gonna zero this out for now. Okay, detail panel. Again, these are just basic standard adjustments. I'm gonna increase the sharpening up to about 50. Radius stays low because a low radius is for an image that has lots of high frequency detail, a lot of detail in it. Low radius, lots of detail. High radius, not a lot of detail. So if you have an image of a face where you just want to outline edges, then you would use a high radius. In this case, I have, especially up here in the trees, I have lots of fine detail, so I want to keep a low radius. And then masking, which is another one of my favorite controls in Lightroom. If I hold the Option key down and I push up the masking, this does an automatic mask to protect smoother areas of the image from sharpening. And the purpose for that is because you don't need the whole image to be sharp, you just need the parts of the image that have detail in them to be sharp. So this allows you to selectively apply sharpening or detail, which is important because it makes the image more organic. The sky up here and the water over here doesn't really need any sharpening because it's smooth and there aren't any real edges. But the foreground here does need it and the trees here do need it. So again, by holding down the Option key and then adjusting the masking control, the areas that turn black are being protected from sharpening and the areas that are white are not being protected. If I go all the way, you can see that basically blacks out the whole image, which is too much. So, you know, you find sort of a middle ground where the areas that you want to stay sharp remain sharp. Everything that's white, okay? I'm gonna add a little noise reduction. This image was, let's see, ISO 200, so it's fairly clean. If I go down here, you always wanna do your detail adjustments and especially your noise reduction adjustments zoomed in at 100% like I am now, because that's the only way to really tell the noise. You can't really tell it when you're looking at it at regular, you know, at a regular view, but when you zoom in 1:1 or 100%, then you can see the noise. And you can see there's some noise in here, not a whole lot. If I boost the luminous noise reduction up to about 20, you know, that gets rid of pretty much all of it. Okay, and again, remember we're zoomed in at 100%. If I zoom back out, there's virtually no noise. If you go too far with noise reduction, remember that noise reduction is the opposite of sharpening. So it's blurring parts of the image. If you go too far, then you start to sort of undo what you're doing with the detail slider, with the sharpening. So be careful with the noise reduction. I would say in general, noise reduction is probably going to be more critical when you make prints. Displaying on screen on your iPad, what have you, the resolution is too small to really pick out a lot of noise unless, of course, you've got a lot of visible noise in an image. But something like this, it's only when you make large prints and you're looking at it on a much higher resolution device like a piece of paper will noise become an issue, okay? Lens correction, this is basically one check. You always want that to be on. Lightroom has a whole database of all the cameras and lenses out there, and it'll automatically figure out what you're using and apply corrections for lens distortion, chromatic aberration, light fall off on the edges. So for example, when I turn it off, you see that? It gets a little warped. When I turn it back on, it straightens out the horizon and it brightens up all the corners. And that's just making up for defects in every lens. And Lightroom actually knows how much based on your camera and your lens. So that's kind of a nice feature, and all you got to do is check that box. Okay. This isn't just a quick note. Well, I'll show it in the next image. This is not necessary with certain cameras. With this particular camera, it is because it doesn't do any lens correction in camera. Some of the newer cameras actually have it built in. So as soon as you shoot the raw image, it's applying lens correction. Okay. So that's it for like the basic adjustments. So basically, I'm looking at it from a global standpoint. Have I gotten the image to look the way I want it to look in general? Am I in the ballpark, so to speak? Do I have the highlights more or less where I want them to be, the shadows more or less where I want them to be? And then from here, I start to think about how I can improve the image to make it more interesting, okay? So a couple of things. Number one, for me anyway, and again, this is going to be subjective based on what you want to do compositionally, this whole area up here needs to be brighter, because I know for sure that those trees were a part of my composition when I was framing the image, looking through my viewfinder. And so if I don't really have a sense of that here, then I know that it's too dark. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit M, and that brings up the graduated filter. All right, one of my favorite filters, which is a filter that works across a straight line, like like a traditional graduated filter that you hold over your lens. Except in Lightroom, it's a lot more powerful because we can adjust it in many, many ways. So let me show you how that works. Another way to get at the graduated filter, by the way, without the keyboard shortcut, is right above your basic panel. You have all the local adjustments here. And the middle one, which looks like an actual graduated filter, like a piece of glass that you put over your lens, you click on that, and that opens up the panel for the filter. And when you hover over your image, you'll have this crosshairs. So I'm going to click and drag here and drag down. And as I'm dragging down, all right, I'm creating the filter. Now, so when I pull down, I get 3 lines. And the center line is where the actual filter, the middle of the filter. So above that line, the effect is working, whatever effect I apply. And below that line, the filter is not working. So that determines the middle of the filter. And then the 2 other lines determine the feather, or the feather. Another way of saying feather is a transition, meaning how gradually the effect goes from full effect up here to no effect down here. The wider these lines are, and you can adjust these lines by hovering over this line, pulling it down, okay? This is a very, very subtle feather, which means that the transition from here to here is very, very subtle. So you can barely notice the effect. At least you can barely notice where the effect changes from being on to being off, so to speak. Whereas the opposite case is if I make these 2 lines very, very, very close to each other, that makes it very obvious where the effect is. All right, and so that's what those 2 lines do. They basically determine the feather. And the easiest way to adjust it for me is just to put your mouse pointer over one of the lines, and it'll turn into a hand, and you can drag down. And also, if you put your mouse over the center, you get these 2 arrows which allow you to rotate the filter around. And also, if you grab the pin is where the actual filter was placed, then you can actually move the filter around. All right, so those are the controls that you have: moving the filter around, rotating it, and adjusting the feather. That's the actual filter itself based on where you're placing it on the image. Now, this particular filter that I just made, this instance of the graduated filter, because you can have as many as you want. I mean, maybe I've used 4 or 5 in an image, but you can have 100 if you wanted. Each one of these filters has this whole bank of controls here on the right. Everything from exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, clarity, saturation, sharpening, and that's one to really think about, because now you can adjust sharpening in your image locally, right? And also has white balance, which means you can adjust the white balance of the filter. So if I wanted to hypothetically cool off the tree, all right, you get that effect, all right? So what I want to do here is I want to basically brighten the top left-hand corner of the image. So I'm going to put this filter up here. Okay, I'm going to make sort of a gradual transition, but not too gradual. And again, I have to see, and then I can dial back the exposure because it's obviously too high. And I'm a big fan of subtle adjustments, because subtle adjustments means that the image looks more organic and more natural. So even at 50, that's half a stop. That's kind of the effect that I'm looking for. You can see now that log and the rocks that are above the filter are much more visible now. You can see the tree has some color to it now. That now becomes a part of the image, becomes a part of the composition, if you will. And so now that is working within the whole image, because really what I wanted was a strong diagonal from bottom right to top left. If this is all black here, that diagonal sort of doesn't work fully. All right? So that's the first thing I would do in terms of that. The next thing I'm going to do is use the brush tool. And the brush tool is my favorite tool of all, because it allows you to, again, locally dodge and burn parts of the image. So to access the brush tool, you hit the K key for brush. It took me a while to memorize that one, I have to say. K for brush. And the the panel over here on the right basically stays the same. I mean, it's a new panel for the brush, but the controls are the same. So once you're familiar with the local adjustment controls here on the right, once you're familiar with what those are, then it's just a question of choosing the tool that you want to use, whether you're using the graduated filter, whether you're using the brush tool, or whether you're using the radial filter. All of those filters are going to use these same set of controls. So once you know that, then you know, okay, I want to darken this area. Which of those three tools is going to be the most effective one to accomplish that? All right, these adjustments here don't change. They're all the same, even though there's a lot, but they're the same. So another nice thing is that in this panel here, there is a drop down that gives you some presets. And while I almost never use presets, these are actually pretty useful, especially the one called Lighten, because it just sets your exposure to 0.25, which I find is a pretty good starting point. All right. Now, one of the things that I didn't talk about in the last presentation that I'm going to talk about now, which is very important, is the brush tool has a lot of sensitivity to it in terms of how it's applied and how it's used, which I think makes it really, really powerful. What I mean by that is, number one, you can adjust the size. So I can use the left and right bracket keys. That's the tiniest. And if I press the right bracket key, it gets bigger and bigger. You also have an adjustment here for size. Okay, I like to use the keyboard because it allows me to work faster. It also has a feather adjustment, which means similar to the graduated filter, it determines the transition from the effect to no effect. The bigger your feather, meaning the bigger the space between the small circle and the big circle, the more gradual the transition is going to be, so smoother, more natural. And the lower the feather, basically no transition, is going to be very abrupt, okay? And I'll show you examples of all of that. But here's where it gets more interesting. You have flow and you have density. And what flow is similar to the opacity control in other applications like Photoshop, for example. So if, for example, on this brush, I set an exposure of 1, so that means now that this brush, as I apply it, it's going to brighten whatever I brush over by 1 stop, okay? And I have my flow and density. I didn't mention density yet, but density is here as well. If I have my flow and density at 100, which means 100%, then I'm going to get a brush that is lightening that part of the image by 1 stop. Now notice that it has a very abrupt edge because my feather is at 0. So I'm going to undo, Command Z or Control Z. I'm going to put the feather at 100, and I'm going to do the same brush. And you can see now how it's the same effect, but the transition is much smoother. So that's the feathering effect, okay? Where it gets interesting is if I set the flow is basically the opacity control. So how opaque each stroke is. If I set it at 25, it means that every time I use this tool, every time I brush with the tool, it's going to lay down the effect at 25% of what my my overall exposure is. So in other words, if my exposure is 1, and I'm using exposure because that's the one that I have set, but whatever control I have here, it's going to lay it down at 25% of its maximum amount based on this. So again, if I brush now, I'm actually brushing in at a 1/4 stop, okay? Because it's the flow is set at 25, that's 25%. Now, if I brush over the same area again, I am now laying down another 25%, which now means that area is 50% brighter, or a 1/2 stop. And if I brush again, okay, I'm at 75, and if I brush again, I'm basically at 100. So every time I brush over the same area, I'm laying down more of the overall effect, which means that when you're using this, you can use the flow control to build up the areas that you're working on instead of just applying a 1-stop brightening effect or a 1-stop darkening effect. So let me show you a real world example of that, right? I have these rocks here in the foreground, and I would like to brighten these rocks, but if I use the density and the flow at 100, and I set my exposure to, let's say, 1/2 stop, okay, as I brush on these rocks here, I'm applying a 1/2 stop of brightening everywhere, okay, everywhere I brush. So I'm brushing on this rock, at this rock, here, okay, everything I'm doing, I'm applying at 100% of my exposure setting, which is a 1/2 stop. But let's say I don't want to do that. Let's say I want to brush in so that I can build up the different rocks so that some of them are a little bit brighter than others using the same brush without changing to a different brush. Okay, I'm going to reset. So down here is the reset button. That just resets that brush so that it basically undoes what I've done. I'll set the flow at 50. And now I can brush here. So everything I'm doing now with this first stroke on the rocks is at a quarter stop, right? Because I set my flow at 50, which means 50%. So I've brined all these rocks, and I'm not going over the same strokes. If you want to see the strokes, you can see those are my strokes, okay? So I'm just going over different areas over here, like that. Now let's say I say, all right, so that's sort of my first pass at brightening up these rocks. Let's say I want to brighten up some of those rocks more than others. Well, as I brush over the same areas, I'm laying down another 50% of my total half stop exposure, which means that this rock here, which is the only one that I've brushed in now, has a half stop of brightening. The others have a quarter stop of brightening. All right. Another trick is another trick. That's radiation in the Hudson River. Just kidding. Another trick is if you press Shift and O, you can change the color of the mask depending on what you're brushing on. Because sometimes if you're brushing something that's red with a red mask, then it makes it really hard to see it. So I like to use this sometimes depending on the image. So, and you can go from Shift O. You can go from red to green to this white to gray to black. I'm sorry, gray back to red again. All right, so that's a kind of a nice handy trick. For example, if I start brushing in the sky, I wouldn't want to use that white mask. The red mask will work great. But if you're brushing in, again, things that are red or things that are green or what have you. Red works fairly well with most images, but I have had examples where I could barely tell what I was doing. And again, the mask is useful. It is useful. But more useful than that is when you start really get comfortable with it, you actually see what you're doing. So I don't necessarily need to see the mask. I just need to see the rock getting brighter. And if I see the rock getting brighter and I can interact with the image this way, well then I'm being much more creative than looking at the mask and seeing where it is, because the mask doesn't determine whether the image is working or not. It's how much brighter this area is getting and how that area is working with the rest of the image, okay? So that's how the flow control works. Again, I like to use flow at about 50 because this way, every time I use that brush, it allows me to gradually adjust the opacity of the effect build it up over time, instead of just going right to a half stop and every time you brush it's a half stop brighter. And again, this idea of making things much more subtle and gradual in an image is what makes an image look much more natural versus, think white and black versus all the hues in the spectrum. It's this gradation that makes an image work a lot better, okay? Now the density control, what the density control does is that it basically caps the full amount of the effect. So what does that mean? It means that if my exposure is set at 1, so this brush now, every time I use it, is going to brighten an area once I do this. Okay, once I put my flow at 100, I don't have to, but once I do that, every time I brush, it's brightening this area by a stop. If I set the density at 50, okay, it caps this brush. By cap, I mean it sets an upper limit. So now, the most this brush will ever be is a half stop, no matter how many times I go over the same area and over and over and over again. All right, and the purpose of that, at first I thought, when I first used this brush, I thought, well, if you only want it to be half, why just not go over here and set the actual exposure control to half? And the reason for that is because you can use the same brush at different amounts and control what the maximum will be. So as an example, if I'm using one brush and I want this tree to only be a half stop brighter, like this, but using the same brush, I want to make this rock a whole stop brighter, then I just set the density at 100. This doesn't change down here, but now I can brush these rocks down here and they'll be a whole stop. So different ways of controlling how the mask works. In other words, the flow control determines how opaque each stroke is, whereas the density control determines the upper limit of that based on what you said here. So as an example, again, if I set density at 50 and I set my exposure control at 2, that means that the brightest or the the upper limit of this brush now is going to be 1 stop, not 2 stops, because I've set it at 50, which is 50%. If I set the density at 25, then it's down to a half stop. One other thing you have to be careful with is that if I set my density to 25, okay, and I've already brushed this area and I brush over it, it lowers the mask in this area down to what the density is set to, okay? So again, this area up here I had brushed in at a stop, okay? Again, I'm using the same brush. I haven't made any new brushes. Once you make a new brush, then it's totally independent and that new brush has nothing to do with this first one, but I'm still working with the same brush. If I set the density at 50, or I'm sorry, at 28, but let's set it at 25, okay, then that means that anywhere I brush with this, anywhere I apply this brush, it's going to be exposure of what? A half stop. That includes areas that have previously been masked off. It'll lower them down. I don't use this very often because what happens is that it darkens this area, or it reduces the mask, but it also continues to work in other areas of the image. So honestly, it makes things a little complicated. It makes things a little complex, and I would might as well just go to a new brush. All right, so I don't use the density all that much. That's how it works. I think the flow control, though, is a lot more powerful. So let me actually do what I meant to do in this image from an actual developing standpoint. So I've reset my brushes. I have no brushes again. I'm going to set the exposure at 0.5, so that's a half stop. I want to brighten some of the rocks here to create an interesting line, or a couple of interesting lines that lead the viewer from here in the foreground up to all the different lines that lead him up to the sky and back around again to these trees and the texture, etc. So my brush is set at a half stop. I have my density at 100, and I'm going to set the flow at 50. And I'm just going to brush some of these areas here. So here, okay, now remember, I'm applying this brush at 50% because I have my flow set at 50. And this gives me a sense of what this looks like. And then I can go back, okay, I like this rock to be brighter now than the other rocks around it that I've already brightened. Okay, maybe over here, maybe a little over here. All right, and you can see now how this area down here, these rock formations down here start to get a lot more depth and dimension because I'm adding this subtle brightening between the brighter areas that are actually getting the light and the darker areas that are in shadow. That's what I meant before about tonality in terms of a compositional effect. Tonality is important because it adds depth and shadow, and it gives things in a photograph 3 dimensions. It gives them a sense of being able to actually reach out and touch them. And when you can do that, then you're much more engaged in the image, and then, then you're on your way to sharing some of what the image means or conveys. Okay. The next thing I want to do to this image is this far side of. Oh, actually, one other thing I want to do here. I'm going to make a new brush. The way to make a new brush is click New up here, and I mentioned about making this water a little brighter. So I'm just going to apply a very subtle brush at 0.25. That's a quarter stop, and it's also at a flow of 50. So my first pass is going to be half of a quarter, so it's going to be like 12.5%, something like that. And I'm just going to brighten this area over here where the water is. And the reason why I'm doing that at a very low setting is because water is very hard to brighten without it looking natural. So, or keeping it looking natural. All right, so I'm just brightening this area down here like so. All right, and you can see how that has a little more color and life to it. The other thing I want to do here is, again, I know because I was there that this far side of the river had a lot more depth to it in terms of those different ridges that you see back there. They're like little hills that are in the image, and I don't really see them as well as I'd like to here. So I'm going to make a new brush. All right, and I'm going to drag, and again, you could turn on the mask. The way to do that, by the way, is in the toolbar down here, there's a little checkbox that says Show Selected Mask Overlay, and if you click on that, then whatever mask or brush you have selected, it will show you the overlay. It's not showing anything now because I haven't actually used this brush yet. But if I selected this one, you could see it there. And if I selected this one, you could see it there. So I'm going to actually make a new one now. And I'm going to just slowly drag across here like that. I'm going to make my brush a little bigger. Okay, and what would I use for this to make those ridges more pronounced? I need a little contrast, right? But not overall contrast, because there's a much better control, which is clarity. So the clarity control, now the reason why I like to leave the mask off is because now as I start to make adjustments, I want to see what's in the picture, not this red mask. So I'm going to uncheck this box here, and now I can add clarity. Okay, and you can see how that brings out a lot more. That's 100% clarity, which is too much, but it's just very subtle. So that's nothing, and that's a little clarity. And you can see how that adds a little more depth, and you can actually make out that there are individual hills back there that are adding a little more interest to the image. Okay, so that's one example of, again, using a brush, using the clarity slider. Knowing, again, that that's what I want. I want to make the different areas and layers of the image deeper, if you will. And one way of doing that is by separating parts of the image, and the way you do that is through tonality. All right. One more thing I want to do is that this part of the river here, I want to make it a little bit darker. And again, these are all very subtle and gradual changes, just to bring out more of the texture that's back here, because actually the middle of the river was covered with small chestnuts and little plants and things growing there. So this is a very shallow part of the river. I'm going to make a new brush. Okay, and I'm going to make it darker, so minus, let's say minus 0.25. And I'm going to brush in here like that. All right, and then one more brush, and this is just going to be a brush to make this give this tree a little bit more interest, which I'm still not 100% happy with. So I'm going to make this a quarter stop. Okay, and I'm going to set my flow to 100% this time, just because I want it to be even. I don't want to actually build it up. It's not a big adjustment, but I'm going to brighten this here, and brighten this over here, and brighten this here, just where the light is hitting already. Okay. So that's pretty much what I do, what I would do with this image. So just to see what the original looks like, that's the original, and that's the final. Same image, same light, same composition, same everything, but now you can actually appreciate what it was that I at least appreciated about the scene, why I actually bothered to make the picture to begin with. The camera has no clue or sense of this. It just captures data, zeros and ones, light and shadow, color. We're the ones that have to give it sort of some perspective. All right? Personality, sure. All right, let's do one more, and then I'll take some questions. This one is a different image. All right, this is one of the cabins in Cades Cove in the Smoky Mountains. Going to the develop module, I talked before about histogram and data and capturing what you need to make the image work. This is kind of the opposite of the last image. In this image, there was no way that I could contain all of the dynamic range without going to something like HDR. I wanted to see what I could do with a single exposure, and whether I could use those bright areas in the image creatively to kind of make them connote something, because that's kind of what I thought about it. What's the image about? Well, to me, the image is about going into this kind of dark space, and actually I have, that's the original, sorry. Knew something was wrong. That's what the original looks like. I think I had a brush that I was playing with there. So that's the original image. It's, I guess what the image means for me is kind of going into this dark space, and then another light space behind it with this door opening and the light shining through. The light is supposed to represent the unknown, something that we don't know. And if you can't make out any detail, that's kind of a lot of times what light like that conveys. Number two, I am almost sure that when I shot this that I wanted it to be black and white, because it's about shapes and textures, light and dark, the color here really doesn't do anything. It's not adding anything to the image. And making it black and white will make it much more graphic because there are also lots of interesting shapes that I like, especially triangles and variations on triangles. And all these lines leading down to the bottom left, bottom right, etc. So this will be a black and white image. So first thing I'll do is adjust white balance. And even if it's going to be black and white, it's still useful to adjust white balance because when we convert to black and white, Lightroom uses the color information to decide what areas are brighter than others. So in general, the white balance is pretty good here. That's too cool, that's too warm. And if I make it too warm, you notice how the light actually gets brighter, and I don't want that light to really get any brighter. So I'm going to leave it where it was, around 4,000. Exposure, I'm going to bring up just a little bit. Again, remember that I'm not so interested in the highlights because those are blown out anyway. Exposure is going to give me an overall sense of whether the image is too bright or too dark. Contrast, I'm going to leave alone because I'm going to use the tone curve, because the tone curve gives me, I think it gives you a much better control over contrast, and has a better, it just brings out contrast better in my opinion. I'm not going to do anything with highlights again because you see what happens with highlights. One thing you have to be careful with highlights is that it reduces highlights in the whole image. Doing this to try to bring back the highlights in the door and in that beam of light kills the specular highlights in the rest of the image. I don't want that. All right, I want to keep the highlights that are here. As little as they might be, you can see when I drop highlights to 100, it kind of gets dead. Shadows, I may use some shadow, okay, just to bring up shadow a little bit. Again, from a visual standpoint or from a kind of conceptual standpoint, I want this area here to be sort of brighter, darker back here. Door has to be much brighter, and this just a little bit darker. Okay, that's kind of what I'm thinking in my mind to see if to make it work. Pull the blacks down a little bit. Definitely add clarity because there's a lot of texture in those wooden beams and the wooden door, and I want that texture to come out, and clarity is great for that. Anything with wood, trees, leaves, grain on rocks, anything like that, clarity is amazing for. Add some vibrance. Now the first thing I do before I do anything else is I'm going to convert it to black and white, because once I start going into the tone curve, then I'm adjusting tonality, and I want to see how those tonalities work in black and white. So quick way to convert to black and white, keyboard shortcut is the letter V. V as in Victor, right? That converts it to black and white. And I'm going to use my tone curve here. I'm going to use one of the presets just as a starting point. I'm going to go medium, and I think I can go a little bit more than that. I'm going to go strong. Okay, that gives me a little bit more drama, a little bit more deeper shadows. Notice what it does to the lines that are coming off of that crack in the door. It makes them stand out more. These are all important because they now become leading lines, diagonals, if you will, up from the bottom corners of the image. All right. Usually once I do that, then I jump into the black and white controls. Normally this is the HSL control for color images. When you convert to black and white, now you have black and white controls, and basically these are adjustments for these particular colors in the original image, but when you adjust these, they either brighten or darken those areas. And I especially like to use this with the target adjustment tool. That's this tool right here. If you click on this, then anywhere you drag in the image, you can notice if you look at the HSL control, the black and white controls, it's actually kind of choosing what color I'm dragging over. And that gives this tool very visual approach, because then you don't have to really think about, gee, what's orange, what's blue, what's red. You just drag over the area. So if I want to brighten this area here, I click on it and drag up, and that's brightening that area based on color. Okay, so I have to be careful that there isn't anything else in the image that has the same color that I don't want to brighten. So that's the key thing you have to remember. It's not just the door, it's wherever that color is found in the image. This area down here, what is this? Looks like it's maybe blues, perhaps. Maybe not, it's hovering around there. So sometimes it gives you precise reading, sometimes it doesn't. I'm pulling down blue, so that makes that area there a little darker. This area right here, all right? Sometimes it's also useful to just adjust these controls manually as well, because you see what they do, what they don't do. Sometimes a target adjustment tool can't quite pick out the exact color. So both approaches you can use, experiment, and see which one works better for your particular image. If you have an image that has blocks of colors, then obviously the target adjustment tool is going to be pretty easy, because you just click on red, click on the sky, blue, drag it down, and you darken your sky. All right, that's how that works. But in this case, if I drag red, you can see what it's doing to the foreground. So look at the foreground, it gets a little bit brighter, and yet when I drag here, it's picking out red, but not exactly. So it takes a combination of both, I guess. Nothing with green, nothing with purple. Let's see here, nothing here. So I'm happy with that. This is, oh, that would be fine. Let's see here. So here's a little advanced trick I'm going to show you. So follow along. These images here are not from, they weren't developed on this computer. They were developed on my main computer at home. So I exported them from my main catalog into this Lightroom catalog. When I import them into this Lightroom catalog, the before and after that I use in my original computer doesn't work, because the before is the way I imported them, and the way I imported them is the finished version. Okay, so how do I get around that so I can show you what the original looks like and go between before and after? Well, I'm going to go to snapshots, and I'm going to hit plus, and I'm going to save this as version 1, because that's where we are right now. And then I'm going to go back to original, so that's the original image. And then I'm going to, this is the current image right now. I have to go up to settings, and I'm going to say copy after settings to before. So now it's going to take the after settings, which are where I am right now, because I clicked on the original snapshot to bring me back here. So this is the current state of the image. I go up to settings and say copy after settings to before. So now when I hit before and after, which is the backslash key above the return key, you see when I go before and after, the image doesn't change, because my before is the same as my after. That's what I just did now. Now if I go back to my snapshots, and go back to where I was when I paused to show you how this works, now this is where I was in developing the image. However, the before is the original. So now when I hit the backslash key, it takes me back to before. All right, so originally, it should work this way when you first import your images. So if you're on your computer, you import them from your camera, this will take you before and after. But I move them around from one catalog to another, and it loses where, it doesn't lose it, but it doesn't actually keep where the original before is. It just sees it as the original image that I imported, and it was finished, basically. All right, so that's the before, that's the after. Okay, detail. I'm going to zoom in here, around here somewhere, to see detail, and especially this area here, which is kind of important. And I'm going to raise sharpening to about 50 or so, 55. Radius can stay pretty low. Why? Because I have a lot of texture in this wood, and there's lots of small, fine texture, so I want to retain that detail. I definitely want to use some masking. I'm going to hold down the Option key, and just to mask off maybe just a little bit, not even a whole lot. As a matter of fact, I'm going to leave the masking off, because I really don't want to mask anything out. If I sharpen this area here, I'm not sharpening anything because it's pure white, and I don't really want to mask off anything. There's no real smooth area, so I would just leave the masking off. I do need a little noise reduction. I think there's a higher ISO. You can see a little bit of noise here, probably down in the shadow area down here. So boost noise reduction to about 25, and that looks a whole lot better in terms of eliminating noise. So 25. Now I did mention before about lens correction. This image was made on an Olympus EM1, which has lens correction built into it. So that's one of these cameras, a Micro Four Thirds camera that has the lens correction built in. So there is no point in checking this box here. The camera, assuming you're using it with an Olympus lens, that's the key thing, it does the lens correction internally. There are other cameras that do it, Panasonic's, Fuji, etc. So you can just check in your manual. Even if you turn this on, it's not going to have any detrimental effect, but you're probably asking Lightroom to look for the profile, which it's not going to find. So there's no need for that. All right, so now let's do some local adjustments here, because this one is going to be important. So number one, I'm going to use mostly the brush tool here. I don't really have anything along a straight line that I want to brighten or darken. So therefore, the graduated filter really is not going to be that useful to me. What I want to do is I want to make this door a lot brighter. Okay, this door here, I want to make this door brighter to kind of connect them a little more visually, tonally, so they have more of the same tonal value. I also want to brighten this area down here so that it doesn't get lost, especially when I make a print, because this area down here in the print will get a little bit darker, and I don't want to lose that. I want actually keep those lines active, if you will. So I'm going to make a brush. I'm going to set it at 0.25. Let's go a little higher because I think I'm going to need more than 0.25. And I'm not going to use the flow or the density because I really want it to be a uniform brightening. If I use the flow, then I'm going to have to brush over a few times, and if I don't brush it over exactly 100%, I don't really want that variation. At least I don't think. The door already has variation in it. You can see there are areas that are darker and brighter based on the tone of the actual wood. All right, so that's one brush there. I'm going to make a second brush. I don't like repeating brushes in other parts of the image, meaning I can brush over here if I wanted to, but if for some reason this door needs more or less of a half stop, then I'm stuck, because then I'm going to affect where I brushed over here. So I might as well just make a new brush and I can keep them independent. All right, so click new, and I'll brush over here a little bit to make this door a little brighter. All right, that's also at half stop. Maybe I'll lower this just a bit. That's 0.3, roughly a third of a stop. I'm going to make another brush, and I'm going to brush in the foreground. Being careful not to brighten this shadow right here, because that shadow is important because it kind of gives more depth to the door. So right now, even though you see me moving the brush over, I'm not actually clicking on my mouse. I'm just dragging it to show you what I mean. But this is the area that I want to brighten here. All right, and you can see if I hover, that's the mask itself. Now you see I spilled over a little bit too much. So let me show you the way to get rid of that, which is pretty simple. Is there, in addition to the brush there's an erase mode to the brush, which means it erases whatever your mask. So the way to activate the erase tool, the simplest way is to hold the Option key down when you have this particular brush active. And when you do that, you see it turns into a minus sign. I can adjust the size, make it a little smaller. And I'm just going to brush over here like so. And again, while I can turn the mask on so I can see the mask, I'm not really interested in that. What I want to see is, as I erase, I want to see the effect. I want to see what it's doing, because then I can see how the image is changing. That might take a little practice on your end, but it's so much more. It's like getting around the middleman and going right to what's actually happening in the image. And if I take too much of this out, so if I hold down the Option key and I brush over here, you see right there, as soon as I did that, that part of the wood floor got darker. I can see, without seeing the mask, that I went too far. So Command Z undoes that. Command Z or Control Z on the PC, it undo your last whatever your last step was. One of the beauties of Lightroom is that there, in the panel here on the left, in the Develop module, there's a history section or history panel, and it shows every single thing I've done in order, but I can jump to any place I want to go back to that point, or to see exactly what it was that I did. So yes, you can erase a brush that you did 10 steps ago. All right, it doesn't have to be in particular order. All right, one last thing I'm going to do is I want to control those highlights a little bit. They're a little bright. I want to make them a little bit more natural looking, so I want to make a new brush. And this is a very precise kind of adjustment. I'm going to make the brush really small. And then I'll show you the masking. And then, so I'm going to brush just this line here. This is where a Wacom tablet or a really good mouse pays off, because I'm just using my trackpad on my MacBook Pro. All right, and then I'm going to darken this. Right now, it was actually set to brightening. So when you brush, when you make an adjustment brush and you use it, it might be set to a control that you don't even want. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, typically if it's set to something that's really crazy, I'll go and actually set it to what I want. Like I wouldn't want it to be 100% saturation because that's not going to do anything. But here we're set to 0.5 exposure, which means it's going to brighten by half stop. Actually, what I want this to do is darken. But I made the mask. There's the mask there. Okay, and then I can go over here and I'm just hitting the down arrow key. So if you click in this spot here, I like to do this, and you see how it made that line a little bit darker. I overstepped a little bit here, so you see what I mean here. Let me, oops, didn't mean to do that. Okay, so I'm going to hold the Option key, make the brush smaller, and just erase a little bit of the mask here. And just by looking at it, I can see that black area is gone. Everyone see that? Right there. All right, I'm also going to use the same brush now. I'm going to repeat the same brush with the auto mask on. So not only do I want to darken this line here of light coming through the crack of the door, I also want to darken the light that's hitting up here, but I don't want the brush to spill over into this door. And this door has a very straight line on it. You see that? A very nice edge. That's where the auto mask feature of the brush comes in handy. So in the mask control below flow and density, or in between, I have auto mask. I turn that on. And what that does is that as you are brushing, it will detect an edge and will keep the brush from spilling over. Let me show you. So if I'm brushing over here to darken this area, and as long as that plus sign doesn't go over the edge of the door, it's not going over the door. Now I'll show you when I show you the mask. All right. So there's the mask. All right, and that's great for anything that has a sharp edge like that. Namely, for example, skies and mountains. If you have mountains or a horizon and you have sky above and you turn auto mask on and you brush in the sky, as long as that plus sign doesn't go over your horizon line, it'll maintain a very nice mask along that line, especially if it's a mountain, because mountain's going to have ridges and trees and things like that. You can experiment. I've experimented with all kinds of different things. Trees, if you're up close and leaves have outlines to them, it'll mask right around the trees. And anyone who's ever tried to do that with Photoshop or with masks knows how crazy that can be with the pen tool. I've done all that. So this is really nice. All right. So that's what that control is there. And if I darken this a little bit, maybe a stop, and I'm going to also add a little bit of highlight control. So I'm going to go up in exposure, and then I'm going to pull down the highlights on that mask. You see, I can go too far, which I don't want, but I just want to go around here. All right, and that's the effect that I'm looking for. I want this to stay bright, but if I can pull back a little bit of detail there like I just did, then that's great. And I did that with a local adjustment, a brush, and then using a combination of exposure and highlights just on that brush. All right, and it also did the same for this line here. I think that line is probably, or that strip of light is probably too bright to recover any detail, but it's a little darker, and by making it darker, it blends in more with the image. One more adjustment, or two more, and then I'm done. One is, this little detail here was kind of interesting to me when I made the image and kind of stood out. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to move up to that little, this sophisticated door lock that they used back then. And I'm going to make a new brush, and I'm just going to lighten. I'm going to turn the auto mask off for the simple reason that it's going to have a hard time detecting all these edges, and I think I can be pretty precise anyway. I just want to darken it in general. I'm sorry, I want to brighten it in general. Yeah. All right, and even over here, look, there's even detail in here that comes out once you brighten it. And same thing over here. I don't really care about the rings. They're just shapes, but this is kind of a nice little detail there. And if I boost this up just a little bit more, like that, okay, it makes that much more interesting now, especially if you make a print. And so I've only added here a half stop of dodging or brightening. All right. One last adjustment, which is split toning. I like to tone, on occasion, I like to tone black and white images to give them more of a certain feel. I'm going to use highlights and shadows. Sometimes I use just highlights to tone the highlights but keep the shadows kind of neutral. In this case, I'm going to do both. So I'm going to set the hue and the highlights to about 50. That's kind of a sepia looking tone. I just know that from experimenting and screwing up. And I'm going to put this around 12, and I'm going to do the same to the shadows. Maybe a different hue. Actually, let's say 40, and let's say the highlights 50, roughly. And I'm going to make this a little bit less. That's 4. All right. And that just gives me a little warmness, a little tone that I think comes across or works well with the image, which is obviously about something that's sort of old and sort of from the past. Okay, not necessarily going to a really rich sepia, you know, kind of. I'm not trying to make it look like an old photograph. I'm just trying to give it more of a sense of what I felt about it. And again, that's the before the original, and that's the after. Okay, capturing the image wasn't about seeing. It was more about really looking deep into the different shapes that were there, and the lines, and the light, and how it was working, and then thinking in my mind, okay, I don't know whether this will work. I don't know whether I can actually make this work, but I sort of like what's happening here, and given the circumstances being that I didn't have a lot of time, I'm just going to grab an image of what just kind of comes, what I sort of instinctually kind of like, and then I'll see what I can do with it at home. But I know what it feels like. So this is not a case of just capturing something and then trying to make something of it in Lightroom. This is capturing what I saw and then thinking, I hope that I can bring across what it was that made me take the picture. So I'm not running around with my thumb on my finger on the shutter button. You know, very rarely, in general, do I actually make images relative to how much time I spend in the field. All right, so that's what I mean. If I'm out for hours, I don't come back with hours worth of images if you're just constantly taking pictures. So you have to see, and you have to think, and you have to be able to, the things that I talked about at the beginning, which is compositionally, vision, and also looking at the visual design elements that I talked about: lines, shapes, tonality, color or lack of color. And then I can come back to Lightroom and say, okay, let me see if I can use the tools that Lightroom gives me to make the image work. All right? All right, so that's my website. You can check that out if you want to find out more about everything I've talked about. I have a blog. There's lots of video tutorials on there, and I write often about this kind of stuff, and you can also find out about workshops and things like that. So thanks very much. You guys have been great.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.